The Valari had always believed they were the rightful rulers of the galaxy. Their wisdom spanned millennia, their empire a testament to intellect over brute force. They had tamed warlike species, bent civilizations to their will, and turned war into a relic of history. And yet, despite all their knowledge, there remained a whisper, a shadow lurking in the myths of the conquered. A name spoken in hushed tones, a name that had no place in the records of reality. Humans. To the Valari, such tales were foolishness, primitive fears of those who needed an enemy to cower from. There was no species called humans, no great warriors of legend, no fleet that once burned the heavens. These were the bedtime stories of defeated worlds, warnings told to rebellious children who dared to dream of freedom. Even as evidence emerged, ruins on desolate worlds, cryptic messages buried in forgotten databases, fragments of old transmissions screaming of their wrath, the scholars laughed. The myths of the lost, they called them, and myths held no power in an age of reason. Yet myths, if repeated often enough, have a way of shaping reality. On the farthest edges of the Valari dominion, beyond the safe borders of controlled space, an expeditionary vessel drifted through the remnants of a dead world. Captain Yularis stood at the observation deck, his silvered eyes scanning the ruins below. The planet had once been vibrant, lush with forests, its skies filled with towering structures that defied gravity. Now, it was a corpse, its surface cracked and charred as though fire itself had devoured it. His crew had uncovered the usual relics of a fallen civilization, shattered cities, decayed machinery, remnants of war. But something felt different this time. Something ancient stirred beneath the dust. "Sir, we've decrypted a fragment of the primary data core," his lieutenant, a younger Valari named Voss, said, eyes wide with uncertainty. "It's unsettling." Yularis turned. "Unsettling how?" "It speaks of an enemy, a war unlike any recorded, a species that fought not with diplomacy or surrender, but with fury. It describes an armada the likes of which we've never seen." Voss hesitated, then swallowed. "Sir, they called them humans." The word hung between them, heavier than it had any right to be. Yularis narrowed his eyes. "A convenient ghost," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. "Another lost civilization that destroyed itself." But the look on Voss's face didn't change. "No, sir. That's just it. They didn't destroy themselves." He hesitated, as if unsure he wanted to continue. "The logs say they vanished." Vanished? Not eradicated. Not extinct. They left. They withdrew from the galaxy, taking their war machines with them. Yularis frowned, the weight of those words pressing against the logical structures of his mind. Entire species did not simply vanish. Civilizations fell, they collapsed, they left ruins and death in their wake. But they did not leave without a trace. A cold whisper touched the back of his mind. He turned to the viewport again, watching the dead world below. It had been so long since the last true war in the galaxy. The Valari had prided themselves on control, on keeping the conquered in line with superior intellect. Yet if these humans had been real, if they had once ruled the stars with fire and iron, where had they gone? And why? The thought was a brief flicker, an ember of unease that he quickly smothered. Myths held no power in the face of reason. Then the transmission came. It was a garbled mess, distorted and filled with static, barely breaking through the ship's encryption filters. The voice was desperate, strained. Screams cut through the distortion. "They're coming!" The bridge went silent. Voss scrambled at his controls, enhancing the signal, but it was already breaking apart. Another voice, frenzied and trembling. "Not possible. Gods, they're real." Then static. Silence. Yularis' fingers curled against the metal railing. "Source?" His voice was sharp, but inside, something in him had begun to tighten. "A Valari colony on the border worlds." "Sir, this isn't a pirate raid. They're not requesting help. They're—" Voss hesitated. "They're warning us." The transmission cut back in for a fraction of a second, just long enough for a final whisper to reach their ears. "They remember." The words sent a ripple through the crew. Yularis felt something he had not felt in decades, an emotion so foreign to his kind that it took him a moment to name it. Fear. A myth had no power. A ghost had no teeth. And yet, deep in his bones, he understood something had awakened, something that should have stayed lost. A cold dread spread through him as he turned to his crew. Set course for the colony. Now, outside, the ruins of the dead world lay still. But for the first time in centuries, the Valari understood the truth. The myths were real, and they were coming. The Valari fleet arrived at the colony in perfect formation, their silvered hulls gleaming against the void. Dozens of battlecruisers, flanked by swift interceptors, cut through the darkness with an air of absolute confidence. Their weapons bristled, their shields pulsed with energy fields designed to withstand any known threat. They were the mightiest force in the known galaxy. And yet, as they drifted over the remains of the Valari colony, the bridge of the command ship was silent. Captain Yularis stood rigid, his eyes locked onto the screen before him. Below them, where there should have been a thriving settlement, there was only ruin. The cities had been reduced to smoldering craters. The planetary defense grid, one of the most advanced the Dominion had constructed, was in shambles, its wreckage scattered like broken bones across the landscape. No distress calls, no bodies, nothing but echoes of annihilation. This wasn't an invasion, Voss murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. This was an execution. Yularis swallowed the knot in his throat. He had seen battlefields before. He had studied the wars of ages past. But there was something unnatural about the silence that clung to this place, something far worse than war. Then the proximity alarm screamed to life. Contact, a tactical officer shouted. Unidentified vessels, approaching fast. Yularis spun toward the viewport, expecting to see the familiar silhouettes of some rebellious fleet, perhaps a splinter faction emboldened by Valari weakness. Instead, the void itself seemed to shift to bend. Darkness peeled away like the layers of an old painting, revealing something that should not have been there. Ships, not sleek like the Valari designs, nor the jagged constructs of pirate clans. These vessels were monolithic, built not for aesthetics or intimidation, but for pure, devastating function. Their hulls were void black, the light itself seeming to shy away from their presence. They moved with a terrifying silence, emerging from nowhere, unmarked by any FTL signatures or hyperspace disturbances. As though they had been waiting, watching. Yularis felt his breath catch as the sensors struggled to register them. It was impossible. No known civilization had ships that could hide from Valari scanners. And yet, these vessels had been here the entire time, waiting in the darkness, unseen, until they chose to reveal themselves. Try to hail them, Yularis ordered. The communications officer hesitated before initiating the broadcast. Unidentified vessels. This is Captain Yularis of the Valari Dominion. You are in Valari-controlled space. Identify yourselves immediately. Silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, the response came. A single transmission. 3 words. We remember you. The moment the transmission ended, the human fleet opened fire. The Valari's forward ships ceased to exist in an instant. Kinetic rounds, traveling at impossible speeds, tore through their shields like they were paper. The leading dreadnought erupted as a projectile the size of a building punched straight through its core. The explosion, so bright, it momentarily blinded the bridge crew. Yularis staggered as his ship shuddered violently from the shockwave. Evasive maneuvers, he barked, but it was already too late. The enemy fleet moved with perfect coordination, their weapons striking with merciless efficiency. Valari battlecruisers returned fire, their energy lances carving through the darkness, but they missed. The human ships moved with inhuman precision, dodging as if they had predicted every shot before it was even fired. Not a single human vessel had fallen. They're reading our strategies before we execute them, Voss whispered, his face pale. It's like they know how we fight. Panic rippled through the bridge. The Valari had always considered themselves superior, their fleets unmatched, their tactics perfect. But now, that illusion was shattering before them. This is impossible, Yularis murmured, gripping the railing. Who are they? A sudden transmission flickered onto their main screen. It was no accident. Asterisk, asterisk, the enemy wanted them to see asterisk, asterisk. The image of a human appeared. His face was rugged, battle-worn, his eyes cold and unrelenting. Unlike the delicate features of the Volari, there was something about him, something primal, a force of nature, unbent by time or war. When he spoke, his voice was measured, but it carried the weight of old vengeance. "You once called us myths," the human said. "You called us ghosts, stories to frighten your children. You laughed at the ruins we left behind, at the warnings we etched into the bones of dead worlds. You thought we had vanished, that we were no longer watching." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You were wrong." The transmission cut out, and then the true slaughter began. Human vessels descended upon the Volari, closing the distance far faster than should have been possible for ships of their size. EMP bursts disrupted Volari targeting systems. Automated drone swarms bypassed defenses, latching onto the hulls of warships before detonating in blinding, precise destruction. The flagship trembled violently as its shields flickered and died. "We're losing systems," an officer cried. "Hull integrity failing." Yularis clenched his teeth. "Retreat." The word felt like poison on his tongue, but he had no choice. They were not fighting an enemy. They were fighting inevitability, asterisk, asterisk. The remaining Volari ships turned, activating emergency warp drives. But before the flagship could jump, a final transmission was received. A whisper, a promise. "Run." Then, the human fleet vanished, disappearing into the darkness just as easily as they had arrived. The battle was over. No, not a battle, a massacre. The Volari had always thought themselves untouchable, their dominion unbreakable. But now, as Yularis stood amidst the ruins of his fleet, he realized the truth. The humans were not myths. They were not ghosts. They were coming. The Volari High Council convened in the Grand Chamber, a vast hall of glass and silver where the most powerful minds of the Dominion gathered to dictate the fate of entire civilizations. But on this day, there was no debate, no arrogance, no lingering air of superiority. There was only fear. Yularis stood before them, battered and hollow-eyed, his uniform still marked with the burns and debris of the massacre. He had been summoned the moment his remaining fleet limped back into Dominion space. The Council demanded answers. But how could he explain the unexplainable? How could he make them understand that everything they thought they knew about power, about dominance, about the natural order of the galaxy, had been wrong? A senior counselor, Valen, leaned forward, her normally composed features marred by tension. "Explain yourself, Captain. How could an unknown force shatter an entire Volari battle fleet?" Yularis met her gaze, his voice devoid of its former confidence. "Because they are not unknown. They were never gone." Silence settled over the chamber. "The humans," he continued, his throat dry, "were never myths. They were never extinct. They have been waiting. And now, they are moving." Another counselor scoffed, but there was no true conviction behind the sound. "You expect us to believe that a lost species, one we have never once encountered, possesses a force capable of rivaling the Dominion?" Yularis slammed his hand onto the table, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. "They did not rival us. They destroyed us." His voice dropped lower, but the intensity in it did not fade. "We did not land a single blow. They outmaneuvered us, predicted us, dismantled us like we were nothing more than an experiment they had already solved." He exhaled slowly, his hands trembling. "We are not the apex of the galaxy. They are." The weight of his words settled over the council, but before they could respond, an alarm blared through the chamber. The emergency warning sigil pulsed a violent crimson, its wail slicing through the stunned silence. A trembling aide rushed inside, their voice barely steady. "A fleet, an unidentified fleet has entered Dominion space." The chamber erupted into chaos. Valen turned sharply, her face paling. "How many?" The aide swallowed. "All of them." The great war map in the center of the chamber flickered to life, and the room fell deathly silent. It was not just a single attack force. not just an incursion. The humans had not come in scattered waves or probing strikes. They had come in full force. Hundreds, no, thousands, of ships darkened the edges of Valari-controlled space, their advance relentless. Their formations were flawless, their approach methodical. There was no demand for surrender, no warnings, only the slow, inexorable march of annihilation. The Council stared at the screen as if their minds could not comprehend what they were seeing. The Dominion had ruled unchallenged for centuries. No species had ever dared a full-scale assault. No force had ever posed a legitimate threat to their supremacy. And yet here they were. The humans had returned. The Council scrambled for orders, for countermeasures, but Eularis already knew. This was not a war. This was judgment. As the first human ships reached the outer colonies, the destruction began without hesitation. Valari defense stations fired upon them, but it was like throwing pebbles into a storm. The humans' weapons were beyond comprehension. Kinetic projectiles moving at near-light speeds, energy pulses that bypassed shields entirely, cybernetic warfare that shut down entire planetary grids before a single shot was fired. There was no grand battle, no drawn-out war. It was an execution. Planet after planet fell in the span of hours. Valari war fleets mobilized, but they might as well have been drifting debris for all the resistance they provided. Every counterattack was predicted, every defense neutralized before it could even be enacted. It was as if the humans had studied them for eons, had prepared for this exact moment. Eularis watched it unfold, powerless, trapped in the nightmare of inevitability. He had once believed the Valari to be untouchable, the pinnacle of civilization. Now he understood the truth. They had never been rulers. They had been children playing at war, while the real monsters slumbered. A final transmission came through, overriding all Valari channels. The same human commander appeared on the screen, his expression unchanged, his voice carrying the weight of history's vengeance. "You thought yourselves gods," he said. "You built an empire on the bones of the weak. You erased histories, shattered legacies, and called it peace." The image flickered, shifting to something older, grainy footage recovered from a forgotten era. It showed a different war, one from before the Valari Dominion had cemented its rule. It showed humanity's final stand. Valari warships loomed over burning human worlds. Ancient broadcasts filled the chamber, echoing voices from a past the Valari had long forgotten. Asterisk, we will not kneel. Asterisk, asterisk, we will not forget. Asterisk, asterisk, and one day, we will return. Asterisk. The human commander leaned forward. His voice was calm. "You should have finished the job." The transmission cut out, and then the true wrath of humanity was unleashed. They did not stop at military targets. They erased Valari's strongholds, shattered worlds, ripped entire fleets from existence. And when the Dominion's leadership finally begged for surrender, when they sent transmissions pleading for negotiations, for mercy, no response came. There would be no treaties, no bargains, only the consequences of forgotten sins. Eularis stood among the ruins of what had once been the Valari homeworld, his once proud people, now nothing more than scattered survivors. He did not weep. He did not curse the humans for their vengeance. Because deep down, he understood. This was not war. This was justice. The sky burned. From the shattered remains of the Valari capital, Eularis stood on the fractured balcony of the Grand Council's ruins and watched the end unfold. Towers that had once stood for millennia, monuments to their empire's strength, crumbled beneath the weight of fire and fury. The streets were filled with the echoes of the dying, but no one called for salvation. There was none to be found. The human fleet had not left after their victory. They had not taken the spoils of war and departed like conquerors. They had stayed. They had made sure there was nothing left to rebuild. Eularis exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of it all pressed down on his chest. The Dominion, the great and untouchable Valari Dominion, was gone. The realization should have felt foreign, impossible, but he had seen the truth written in fire across the stars. The humans had not come for conquest. They had not come for power. They had come for erasure. A shudder ran through the Earth as another orbital strike slammed into the northern district, the explosion sending a shockwave of heat and dust through the already broken landscape. Yularis barely reacted. There was nothing left to react for. Behind him, Voss stumbled into the room, his once pristine robes now torn and blood-stained. His breathing was ragged, his golden eyes wide with something Yularis had never seen in him before. Pure, unfiltered terror. "They won't stop," Voss rasped, his voice hoarse from smoke and despair. "They won't stop until every last one of us is gone." Yularis already knew that. Through the haze of destruction, he had seen the way the humans moved, silent, methodical, unrelenting. They did not revel in the slaughter, nor did they show any hesitation. There was no mercy in them, because why should there be? The Valari had not been merciful when they wiped the first human worlds from existence, long before even Yularis' ancestors had been born. They had not hesitated when they declared the species unfit to exist in their perfected galaxy. And now, that same certainty, that same righteous finality, was turned against them. Voss clutched Yularis' arm, his grip tight, desperate. "We have to surrender. We have to." Yularis slowly turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Surrender? They don't want prisoners," he continued, his voice cracking. But if we plead, if we beg, maybe—" Yularis shook his head. There would be no negotiations, no ceasefire. This was not war. It was history correcting itself. A distant whine filled the air, a sound Yularis had come to recognize all too well. The final strike. Voss' eyes widened as he scrambled toward the balcony's edge, peering into the firestorm below. Above, the last of the human dreadnoughts shifted into position, their weapons primed, the glow of their cannons like miniature stars waiting to collapse. They had given the Valari time to understand, to feel it, to experience helplessness for the first time in their species' existence. And now, the final lesson was here. Yularis did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched as the skies split apart. The impact came all at once. A storm of light and sound. A force beyond anything their architects could have imagined. The Grand Chamber, the last standing relic of Valari power, disintegrated in the heat of the blast. The city, once the jewel of the Dominion, crumbled like sand beneath the judgment of ghosts. For a brief moment, as the fire roared toward him, Yularis saw it. Not just destruction, not just vengeance, but justice. The humans had been erased from the stars once before, and now the galaxy would finally understand. Humanity had never been myths. They had always been inevitable.